So some of you may already be aware of Art South Asia Project, so I can start with an intro to that, to us before, if as people join, and hopefully you wouldn't miss much. So Art South Asia Project, or ASAP, is a UK-based arts education and development nonprofit established in 2021. Its mission is to facilitate and expand networks of collaboration and research, documenting and highlighting narratives and histories of modern and contemporary South Asian visual and applied arts. It supports initiatives through grants and by creating opportunities for engagement, partnering with individuals and institutions within South Asia and the UK. And ASAP creates programs around research, archiving, and publications, and fosters professional development through workshops, talks, symposia, and fellowships. So for the last couple of years, we've been really lucky to be working with Ben Cook and Lux and the British Council on Art Exchange Moving Image, which is a cross-cultural curatorial professional development and exhibition program for early to mid-career visual arts curators from Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So we've been involved in the South Asia portion and the exhibitions that the 5 curators who have been selected via open call are still ongoing in South Asia. So we're really excited to be working with them with works from the British Council Visual Arts Collection. So as part of this program, we've put together an Art Murmur talk series to kind of enliven and make a public moment to people who may not actually be able to see the exhibitions in their home countries. And we're really, really fortunate to have Naeem Mohaiemen and Ben Cook today. And Naeem is a very well-known practitioner of moving image from Bangladesh, based in New York, but he's also part of one of the exhibitions that we've been lucky to work with for Kekasha Saba's show. His film Grace is part of that exhibition, which happened, I think it's about May, but I may be wrong. But that's already happened in Dhaka. So before I introduce these wonderful speakers, I'm just going to say a few housekeeping points. So the idea is that this first session will take place for about 45 minutes to an hour, and we'll have time for questions after. So please do put your questions in the chat, and then we'll read them, or I'll read them out loud, and Naeem and Ben will speak to them. Please do stay on mute during the duration of the session, just so we don't get any interference. And if you have any friends who've missed it or you want to revisit this talk, it will be recorded and it will be put on our website and our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. So I'm not going to be doing much talking in this. I'm just going to quickly do the bios for Ben and Naeem, and then I'll hand over to them both to talk. So firstly, Ben Cook is the founder director of Lux. Was the founder director of Lux? Or do we say is? We say both.
I always will be.
You always will be the founder director of Lux and Lux Scotland, the UK agencies for the support and promotion of artists working with the moving image, and has worked in the visual arts and independent film for the past 25 years as a curator, producer, writer, and teacher, after originally training and working as a film archivist. He now works as an independent art and film producer and a practicing Gestalt and nature-allied psychotherapist. So over to Naeem. Naeem combines films, photography, drawings, and essays to explore forms of utopia, dystopia within families, borders, architecture, and uprising, beginning from South Asia and then radiating outwards to transnational collisions in the Islamic world after 1945. Several conversations around non-alignment as a concept container in contemporary art pivoted after the premiere of his film Two Meetings and a Funeral 2017 at Documenta 14 in Kassel. And you can see Naeem's work currently in London, if you are based in London, as part of an Art Angel presentation in St. James's Park. So I'm going to hand over to Naeem and Ben, and Naeem can probably talk a bit more about what else, other things you can see his work at. But I'm going to get out of the camera and the video so I can let these two have a wonderful conversation. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you, Marla. So I just want to set some terms for the conversation perhaps first. So first I want to say thanks to ASAP for inviting us. And it's always a joy and privilege to be in touch with and to talk to Naeem. We've worked together a number of times over the years and known each other for a few years now. But I just want to say something about this conversation first, because I know it's couched in the subject matter of moving image in South Asia, which is a huge subject. And I think too much maybe really for us to take on, just the two of us in an hour. And obviously we're talking about a huge region, a huge history. So I just want to say at the beginning, this will be a very subjective conversation about maybe moving image practices between Naeem and myself, and in some ways tangentially related to that subject matter. So I hope that sounds okay to you, Naeem.
Yeah, I think then you're also maybe pointing to the fact that we both feel that that's such a large subject. We wouldn't want to try to be authoritative in any of our pronouncements because the experiences are so incredibly specific, including, what Mala referenced to, which is the fact that there's the project right now in London, Through a Mirror Darkly, which is related to Asia in the sense that it's about the Vietnam War, but isn't South Asia per se. But alongside it is a project in Ireland, which is about Bangladesh and Bangladeshi film. So these questions of representing South Asia or South Asian art practice is anyway quite complicated. So I appreciate the, I guess you said terms of the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, to be honest with you, I don't want to like burden you and your work with just that context as well. I think that's a heavy burden to carry. So I thought what we could really do is start it much more from a conversation about our own experiences and particularly around your practice, and kind of circulate out, maybe infer something broader from that. So I just wanted to start with this very kind of obvious point first, that your major works have been in moving image, and I'm sort of curious about how you understand the traditions in which you work as a practitioner.
So thinking of traditions in which I work, I think my very early introduction into this space, which was in 1980s and 1990s Bangladesh, was in a space where all moving image was either the cinema, which was considered the space for other people, practices that were deeply aligned with and embedded with and good at speaking with commerce and capital. We had a few filmmakers who broke through with independent cinema in the Satyajit Ray neorealist mode, or Mrinal Sen or Ritik Ghatak mode, who might have ended up having a week-long or 2-week-long theater run. But broadly, most of theater was seen as just kind of cinema that we couldn't even relate to, never mind trying to make it. And I think for me, an early like a split in your brain or your viewing brain, never mind coming to your making hands, was when VHS arrived as a technology that the government basically didn't regulate. So when VHS cameras first arrived, there was quite a long period when the government didn't know to tax them, which is always a relief when you're off that grid. And VHS started in Bangladesh in the quite traditional way, wedding videos, cricket games, etc. But very soon also became this place for slightly subversive, slightly underground documentary practices. For example, Tarek Masood, who's passed away, who was a mentor to many of us, Manzare Hasin Murad, many others who you would have access to the VHS camera and maybe even do some commercial work. And in that world, the commercial work was for international NGOs, and that would be in the category of do good documentaries on. I think climate change hadn't really arrived as a category yet, but certainly improvement of rural poverty situation, etc. So you had that. You had the specter of working with the equipment available on your what people would call the day job, even though it wasn't like a full day kind of thing, and then separately making the documentaries that they really wanted to do. So in my head, VHS, early VHS, and then early video, all the other formats that came, High 8, everything else, was the space where people did what they really wanted to do. And it was also the rise of the self-organized screening. And that's pretty early. I mean, I was maybe 18 years old already to see people organizing their own screening, and it's just their friends, and they're quite happy with that. And that's where it stays. So that I think was a very early influence in my head of technology as a way to just be outside the grid. We understood cinema on celluloid to be the proper cinema that wasn't going to be a space for us. And so very early on, there's a person I should mention. He's quite forgotten in Bangladeshi video history, Ejaz Ahmed Khan Mojlish, or Iju Bhai as we called him. He was a like a technical wizard who also would make these documentaries and always actually chastise me for making documentaries that were not clear enough. He would quite affectionately say, "This is a little too abstract," and they weren't even that abstract, but they were perhaps a little too abstract for him. And he was also a very early model of somebody I knew, somebody I work with, who would also figure out the gear, right? So for a day job, he actually figured out how to make a 3-channel video switcher on his own, because in those days you couldn't really, that's one thing you actually couldn't import without paying a tax. So he just figured out how to make the switcher himself, even though that's available. And you had this thing in your head of the filmmaker as also a technical tinkerer. And so that was a early way I thought of these practices. I know it's a very diffuse way to answer what you said. And in a way, I suppose my touchstones are technological endpoints rather than a film I saw that really changed my life. I mean, obviously, I would just say, just to give the example of the few people who got through the system, Surjo Dighal Bari was a film that got through the system, black and white, neorealist, hard-edged portrayal of village life. But making that film was so intense for the director that we all understood that that's a film we would admire but would never try to make. In fact, the lesson that you learned from there is that Film Development Corporation is not a building you ever want to set, a compound you ever want to set foot in, because you had heard stories about his negatives getting destroyed, etc., etc. It's kind of a iconic story of the film that almost never got made. So I suppose to pull it together, not just technology, but an early idea that we are in this other space that nobody pays attention to and is just for our friends. And there was therefore freedom, right? It's also a space, by the way, where there were no censor board regulations for a long period, because video was just not considered cinema, therefore no censor requirements. That was intense freedom that people did a lot with.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate you raising this question about sort of material conditions, because I think that's something that's forgotten about a lot in these moving image histories, that often so many of these histories are shaped by the networks around them, about who had access to what technology, because fundamentally this is a technologically determined form of practice in some way. So it's really is affected by literally what you can get your hands on and what you're able to see.
Right.
And for you,
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry,
something else.
Sorry. Go.
I'll just add one thing because it'll slip out of my head. It was also very early on the idea of, if you're a creative individual, you also have a day job that uses the same technology. And I think that's been very helpful over the last 20 years. The idea that you hope that your day job is in the same field somehow. And, I always think of Harun Farooqi's long engagement with German television as a place that was his day job, that also became, because of the nature of German television for a period, where he also premiered some of his films, maybe many of his films. In Bangladesh, it was the day job allowed you to do commercial projects and at the same time be shooting your real project, right? And you might actually have been assigned by Concern, which was a very large NGO in the 80s and 90s, to do a project on rural electrification. But you are out there, Iju Bhai was certainly out there filming other things in the village, which were the elements of the documentary he really wanted to do. So also this idea of reusing, because the large organization doesn't own all the material you shoot, and actually they don't care what you do with the rest of it. They care about a very directed, I would say, results-based video making. Show us the result of the electrification project, the 200 homes that have received electricity for the first time. Meanwhile, you might be fascinated by the fact that television has also arrived for the first time in that village, and you're off filming the television screen in a house, and you're also for the first time experiencing the flicker. And you're thinking, is this flicker damaging the image, or is this flicker something I want to lean into, right? So people also came upon these image elements actually even as part of their quote unquote day job.
Right. Fascinating. And in terms of your own motivation, like what would you say drew you towards this?
I think very early on, I was drawn by our what is very specific. Well, it's actually not specific to Bangladesh, but it's a specific flavor. What I would call our history wars, a quite sustained 55-year um, struggle over the meaning of history. In Bangladesh, very much centered around the liberation war, which 55 years later still is the both uniting and dividing element. Very represented and then not represented in cinema and moving image practices. And the way that that also, in order to function as a main space for the national narrative, has to erase everything that comes before. So the period that Bangladesh was also Pakistan, East Pakistan, has to in all sorts of ways be erased or negated or forgotten. And then the period even before that, when it's part of British India, British colonial India, but which also means it's part of this united entity of Bengal, East and West, West Bengal now being part of India. All of those things in some ways have to be erased, right? So I just remember one of the things I remember that even in my way my parents' generation spoke about their cinema references, um, they spoke about their cinema references from a time. My father's born in 1936, so pre 47. Um, from a time when people didn't so clearly make the distinction between East Bengal and West Bengal, and didn't so clearly, at least in the space of cinema, sharply differentiate between what is also Muslim majority East Bengal and what is Hindu majority West Bengal. Your cinema icons might be Suchitra Sen and Uttam Kumar, and you could register that without registering that they're not Muslim actors necessarily. But then the same people, my parents, my uncles and aunts, after some time would understand that the narratives they were telling also had I wouldn't say people who don't look like them, but people who are not their co-religionists. And after some time, that mattered for them. And I was struck from a very young age. My father, both my parents actually were big cinema going people. They have all their memories of going to the theater. I started noticing how the way they remembered their favorite cinema started changing. They themselves became aware of the religious identity of their iconic figures. And so from very early on, I had this thing rotating in my head, which is cinema as a carrier of national stories. And then, cinema doesn't happen overnight, right? You don't, you know, from one week to the next, come up with a completely different cinema that erases the civic. There was this uneasiness about who were the cinema icons. And so that really sharply stayed with me. I became very aware of the possibility to look at the same object and see very different things. In my family, I had done a book of drawings around my father's photographs, and there's this fascinating through line of how the older relatives are referred to spontaneously with um, appellations like Didi and Dada or Da, which is a way of saying older brother, older sister, but also over time were identified as a non-Muslim way of speaking about them. These are highly contested terms, of course, so put quotes around everything I say. And at a certain time, my same family members started referring to younger relatives as Bhai and Appa. And it's in the same family, by the way, older family members, younger family members. And, as a young person, you're really struck by this. You're wondering why those older relatives have da and di at the end of their names, and why the younger relatives have bhai and appa at the end of names. And nobody's speaking it out loud, but you're starting to understand that the same object looks different. And I think that burrowed in my brain as I started making films, as I started looking at I think it instilled in me a wariness about very confident pronouncements. Even Ijubhai, who really was my video mentor, filming and editing from a very young age. I started working in his. He ran a magazine called Video Guide, and I started working there. I think when I was 14 or 15, still in high school, to the total chagrin of my parents. Even he and I would argue. right? And he had a loyalty to a more settled history, and he had his own demons that he wanted to battle, and mine were different. So I think it's quite transformative if you're 16 years old and you're arguing with your mentor. You
Mm.
don't usually do that. And so that, I think, came into my um, filmic practice. I think a very early memory is of using Ijubhai's video equipment. Of course, he was the one with equipment. I didn't. Using his editing panel, sitting next to him and having him show you everything, but then disagreeing about a cut because he wants something to be like fully fleshed out, because the ambiguity, he wants things to be clear. He always would say, make it clear. And I mean, I wouldn't say I was trying to be that ambiguous at age 16, but I was starting to already feel uneasy about things being that clear. And I think to argue with your cinema mentor, and to have, by the way, a video mentor, rather, a video mentor who is willing to argue back and doesn't say, get out of this house and never come back, which is a very traditional, guru shishya relationship in South Asia, of you just
Mm.
listen obediently until one day you just break off and go off your own, which is why we also have in film and in other fields this specter of the guru shishya works together for 10 years and then they break up and never speak to each other again. It was not that. I was fortunate with the mentors I had.
Right. Okay. And sort of related to that, as you have quite a substantial writing practice as well. I'm kind of curious, like what does moving image enable you to do that writing doesn't?
Yeah, this is a great question, and actually connects again to Ejaz Bhai. I mentioned he ran this magazine, Video
Yeah.
Guide magazine, and so I was writing for him while also learning how to edit video. Um, I would say that writing for me was a way to perhaps try to complete the argument or to get somewhere with it. And film was a way to stay unresolved. And one reason film or video was a place to stay unresolved is you always had this absence of material. Um, Now, 20 years later, we all have various methods of archival reconstruction. Filling in the gaps. If you don't have a moving image archive, you do have ways of using the still photograph to animate the archive. There are numerous techniques of animating it as well, so that you forget you're looking at a still image. But back then, we had this sort of adherence to everything has to be found on video or filmed on video. That means that you're always dealing with certain things that are not captured on video. You don't have the interview. The person has passed away. The person has refused to give you an interview. You didn't get there on time. It rained on that day. You're always dealing with absence. And with writing, you didn't have that same absence, because it was based on, even if you haven't met that older woman in that village who is carrying that story, you met someone else who's interviewed them already and is telling you the story. So writing felt like a space where you could complete the sentence, and video was always a place where things were always missing and you made do. So I think from an early time, uh, for me, the way video worked was, okay, ambiguous by choice, incomplete by choice, but also incomplete because you were missing material. And actually, a very good example, if I can bring in a contemporary example, is the film that's showing in Ireland right now, A Missing Can of Film, which is about filmmaker Zohir Raihan, who was killed at the end of the 71 war. On screen, I have very little if you watch it. Like, it's all about the absence, because that's all I could get. I don't have an interview with a family member. I don't have actually a picture of the chair where he sat, because that chair doesn't exist, or I didn't find it. But prior to doing this film, for this year, I was trying to write an essay about him. And one of the reasons I was trying to write an essay was because I had found material verbally in documents that were more comprehensive. And I had in my head this narrative that, to give him his due, writing was the better form, because you could document everything, including all the parts of his life that are pre-71, for which records don't exist, simply because also it's the 1950s and 60s, and who's keeping copies of anything, as opposed to our current moment when we're constantly self-archiving. This Zoom here is already recorded as we're going into it. So I would say that the fork is like this. The writing becomes where you can chase down every last uh, entrail or trail, and video becomes a place where you leave things absent. And over time, that becomes also the way you think about certain projects that you think deserve clarity, or there's something needs to be traced. So they live alongside. There are, of course, sometimes very practical exigencies of, you're writing for one kind of audience and making the film for a different one. And also language comes in very clearly, where the film might have a Bengali language sequence with subtitles, whereas the essays are often in English. Although I've just last year published the first book in Bengali, and I also write differently in Bengali than I write in English. The two languages function in very different ways.
And to extend that question a little bit more, I want to return to something that you said earlier about abstraction in some ways, like making meaning. Now, I'm really conscious your practice is very international. Like you're showing your work all over the world, and you're navigating between quite specific cultural, political histories to international audiences in all sorts of different places. And I was interested to hear you talk about that question of abstraction coming up in your early career. And I wonder how you still think about this particularly this kind of balance of like explaining, telling, contextualizing, and how you kind of navigate this question. How much information do you feel you have to give? How much abstraction can you allow? And how you think about that, particularly in terms of all of these different audiences that are going to meet your work.
Right, and it's the nature of the audience isn't also always something you choose, right? Which is why I think this format of the Zoom conversation that all of us became used to during the pandemic and then continued in a way has been such a fascinating bend in the road where you can be, ceaselessly reaching across time zones and against the practicalities of finance of having to fly someone somewhere. I think that's really extraordinary, the way that we can connect. I mean, I can see there's light behind you, and I suppose there's light somewhere behind me, but it's a little past 8 in the morning here, and this is quite familiar experience. I mean, I have this whole thing for the last 20 years of, if I'm in New York, I'm calling Dhaka at night, it's daytime. We've found ways of working that are based on the fact of, okay, early morning for me is evening for you, but I won't call you after 12 noon because you're getting ready for, so these time zone things is possible with Zoom. The international audience you talk about is partially because of how contemporary art circulates, right? So Grace, which was the film actually about a woman who goes through the process of euthanasia in Maine in the United States, was included in Kekasha's film in her exhibition in Dhaka. So that's actually a American protagonist engaging with healthcare in the US and these prohibitions against euthanasia. The ending of your own life when facing a disease, and it's showing to a Dhaka audience, right? Which, with Bangla subtitles, but also in a part of town in Dhaka where there might be more people walking in who also speak English as a second language much more easily. So there are all these, and then the flip side is, of course, the film that's showing in Ireland right now too. I would say, because of the nature of the EVA International, it's a very Irish audience, right? That's the primary audience there. I wasn't conscious of it going in, of where things were going to show. We always expect that it will show majority perhaps in Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, South Asia, and maybe much less in northern nations. But sometimes distribution networks means that actually the reverse happens, right? Something circulates more where you don't expect it to happen. I think I've had to explain a lot. All of us have. I mean, probably many people on this Zoom in the audience are quite used to that phenomenon of, the artist talk or Q&A right after the screening or right after the first screening is built in partially because that's a form of programming everybody understands, right? It's why people will come to a certain thing, but it's also when you explain. We grew up with this director Abdullah Mamun, who directed somewhat high form, slightly abstract television dramas. And there was a famous thing that you would always hear, or that was said about him, which is that his plays were high thought, which means they go over your head. And then you'd say in Bangla, Bujhaya bolen, which means come on, explain it. And even Bujhaya bolen is a particular kind of form which suggests I'm from the street, you're highfalutin, urban elite. You must explain it to us because we are the majority. So there was also that class war in the reception of his TV dramas in a way, at least as I remember it, 1980s. So I was also used to that idea that not explaining is somehow an elite response, and explaining is the more democratic form. That's, by the way, not even getting to the international audience, just in Bangladesh. Again, coming to my debates with Iju Bhai. But certainly you had to explain more when it was in a place outside of South Asia. And certainly after 2001, especially, when the whole security panic period of modern global life begins, we were all, you use the word burden, we were all burdened by representing something more than your film, something more than your geography. You started representing a idea of Muslim citizenry. And as the poet Shame Ali Naeem said, famously to me once, Islamophobes don't care how pious you are. They don't even care if you are actually Muslim, right? Muslim is a container that stands in for all sorts of things. It's a racial signifier now in certain situations. So I definitely experienced that post 2001 of also having to represent a Muslim subjectivity, and which I said, uh, somebody not that can also be asked to represent that. And so there's a lot of over explaining in those days, I think. There's a lot of something that was quite obviously tiring after a while, you made a film about something completely different, but they also want to ask you about, yeah, but what about this other thing that happened? And sort of like, that has nothing to do with my film. And you could take the defined role of, I don't want to answer that question, or you can be like, okay, I'm here. Maybe this is the only chance. So I think film got burdened by that explaining context even more than film. And the abstraction came from people's unfamiliarity with the material, right? So a story about Zohir Raihan would be very familiar to a Bangladeshi audience. They might even say, "Oh, another film about Zohir Raihan," because they've seen many. Whereas in Limerick, and I'm just talking about the very recent experience, it's fresh on my mind. None of that is known, right? So then you have the choice of whether to go and explain Bengal, 1947, partition, Pakistan, 1971, or just let it be. And the curator of Eva, Esther, also at some point said, I feel like the audience won't understand. Do you want to explain this a little bit more? And I said, no. And she was okay with it. But I think 10 years ago, I would then go back to the editing room and be like, okay, let's add more explanatory text. I mean, the explanatory text at the beginning of the film was something we're very familiar with, both commercial cinema and independent documentary video. That the first would be the text, you
Sure.
know. And then it's like the beginning of Star Wars, except it doesn't roll. And that's a rupture when you can be like, no explanation,
Sure.
just going to be plunged into it.
And I'm still kind of curious where you would position yourself now in terms of that thought of things going over the head versus, I imagine there's something political also about not explaining. Is there not?
Right. There is the political gesture. Do you mean politically progressive, politically impactful?
Yeah, who are you explaining to? There's a kind of ascendancy of knowledge in some ways.
Right.
That's what I mean. That's what I mean. That, like you said, to show that in Bangladesh, you don't have to explain it. So then do you have to change the work to explain it to everybody else in the world? Or could everybody else in the world do a little bit of work in terms of finding out about this?
Right. I mean, the way the work changes, by the way, because of course you don't make two versions, is that the wall text can be overly explanatory and often is. That's also the part that you sometimes don't have control over, or the Q&A, right? Because there you don't have control over what questions asked. And like I said, if you want to reply, you explain. I think the politics there, if I can even define it that way, but um, is to argue that whether you're familiar with it or not, you should figure it out as we have. Right. So I had written this essay, Hegemony, a couple of years back. It's in the Midnight's Third Child anthology, where I said, I'm not in. It's a fact that certain elements were already known to everybody, certain elements that came from, for lack of a better term, Western context were overfamiliar everywhere. And we're not asking necessarily to erase all that, but asking that that person from that context should also be equally familiar with the context here. I'm familiar with the entire work of children's literature from Enid Blyton, because like all post-colonial, post-British Dominion nations, those books circulated when I was young, right?
Mm.
But why didn't our book circulate over there? That would be I'm not
Yes.
asking that we erase Enid Blyton. I wanted that Indrajal comics that I grew up with would be something familiar, so that the politics is on insisting that you have to figure it out yourself. By the way, even in Bangladesh, the largest English language newspaper, Daily Star, that I wrote for years and still sometimes write, would insist, the editor would insist, not the sub-editor, that if you have a Bengali phrase, first of all, that it has to be italicized to differentiate, and then it has to have a
Wow.
bracket meaning. And I would say, but everybody reading this newspaper knows what dudh bhat, which means like a soft or not counting person, or various kinds of terms of not neutral. Anyway, it's a very specific phrase. The dudh bhat doesn't have to be explained, right? But even within that, an English language newspaper would say, no, explain. So there was that whole internal thing of, even to a Bengali language audience, Bengali had to somehow be translated in brackets.
Mm.
But I would say, though, just to clarify, there are other. Yes, thank you, Sadia. It's milk toast is a much more correct translation. Sadia has given the translation on the chat. Dudh bhat, I mean, the way we use dudh bhat is like in the cricket team. If you were number 11, it's towards the end of the game. You're dudh bhat because they know you're not going to score any runs. And so I was actually dudh bhat of the family, or the school cricket team. That's why I remember it so well. I was just going to say there are other makers from South Asia who have far more of an abstract practice than I do. If anything, I
Mm.
also struggle sometimes with withholding things, because I feel like, oh, but I know all these things about Zohir Raihan. I should let some of it trickle out, because I also don't know if I'll be there for the Q&A.
Yeah. And it's really, and it's fascinating to hear you talk about all of this metatextual stuff in some ways as well, that you're talking about the wall text and the Zoom talk and all of this explanation and framing around things as well. And I'm still with that kind of tension of the over the head versus this kind of colonial idea
Right.
of like having to explain back to some
And
nebulous audience.
and over the head was never an indication, mathar upor diye jai was not an indication that I'm short, right? That,
Mm.
it's more indication of you are deliberately going above us.
Yeah.
And this was, by the way, a comment made about television drama, which is about the most democratic form that existed in 1980s Bangladesh. Cinema, television had far more viewership, or at least an urban viewership. So to not talk down to the audience, but talk over their head to an invisible audience was seen as, then why are you doing this? And television dramas didn't also have a second market of going to a film festival. So it isn't like, oh, it's going to go to Busan, that's your real audience. It's like,
Yeah.
you have no audience kind of thing. And it kind of, yeah, it was one of the things that was always said about Al Mamun, actually. I mean, I'm a big fan of his television dramas, but also I have to admit they were quite obscure and opaque at times.
Sound amazing. So, leading on from this, I want to ask you about something, a kind of a broader question about how you think about the kind of ontology of film in some ways. Like, what other effects and pleasures are there? I'm kind of interested in like digging into that question of abstraction, but also like things like affect and how much you think about that, these kind of qualities of moving image consumption in some ways as well, both the possibility to transfer something to the audience, but does that, because I hear very clearly these questions about information and how much to reveal and how much not to reveal, but I'm curious about these other qualities as well around things like affect and what it means to experience something more what does abstraction open up? Is that something that you think about as well?
Probably subconsciously, not in a I try not to be very conscious about what affect I want to put the audience into, because in some ways it's never in my control anyway. I suppose when I'm deep in a project, which is a stage when you stop reading emails or picking up the phone or seeing anyone, you develop these night hours where nobody's awake, so nobody's around. And I certainly had that this whole summer leading into the film premiere in London. That's fugue state that you enter, where you're just with yourself and your thoughts, and you keep watching the same thing. And there is a stage when I personally experience something that I've edited already many, many, many times. The experience of just being in there, just watching it and being in a dream. Um, that's the moment when I've stopped thinking about how long it is, what the issues with the footage is, what I have to get permission for, what deadlines I have. And maybe I aspire to something like that for the audience, to also get lost and stop thinking about who they're watching or what they're watching or what venue they're in or how hard is the seat or I have to see another thing right after this. So let's spend 5 minutes here. I'm not suggesting it's all about like enchantment and keeping you in there against your will, but something about just being lost in the space is maybe what I aspire to. Sometimes that comes in the moment in the film where music enters. Sometimes it's the part where you've stopped the narration and the characters, whether in nonfiction or fiction, have stopped speaking, and this is your space to just be with the scene with no utility except just pure pleasure. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about pleasure. About libidinal energy, although they're sternly anti-libidinal in some ways, some of my films. Yeah, even the one that has a romance at the core, which is Joledo Bena, Those Who Do Not Drown, also has an anti-romance, without giving it away, which is that it's a ghost story. But there is, in that film, for example, there are parts where I am in a dreaming. And I wish to produce that, or hope, I can't say wish, that the audience would feel some of that also. Yeah, pleasure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, pleasure. There's a part in Through a Mirror Darkly where every time I would run it again, I would just stand up and do a little, this is too revealing, but I would do a little, you know, pleasurable solo dance in the room. And I know that's not going to happen during the actual screening because people aren't going to get up and they'll be conscious of person to their left and right. But that was like a very pleasurable, solitary dancing with myself that I hoped would happen to at least a few people.
Yeah. Well, thank you for saying that, because I recently watched a Missing Can film, and
Oh,
and I had it in my head because we talked about it before, and you talked about this. Oh, there's so much information that you won't know. It becomes abstract and things like that. And there is so much pleasure. There's so much pleasure in that work for me. And I really appreciate what you said about libidinal energy as well, because there's so much more. I mean, going back to what's the difference between filmmaking and writing in something, like there's so much that opens up in there. There's like rhythm and juxtaposition, and there's sound, and there's a lot of things acting upon me which I imagine, these are some of the qualities of film, possibilities of film. It's a real pleasure to hear you. I love this idea about you dancing, because I
when
think
nobody's
that
watching.
yeah, well, yeah, but I feel like there's something about I feel like there's something that enters. This is what good art is in some ways. There's something that can be like that can enter, and then doesn't have to be explicit, but there's somehow like an energy. There's like an energy within it. And I appreciate maybe naming that as libidinal energy as well somehow, because I feel like yeah, Missing film is very, very engaged. It's a very, very engaging work. It's very positive. It's very, very engaging. And I think it does encourage some kind of dream state. It does encourage some dream state. I get a lot out of it without knowing. And I'm aware there's a lot of history that I'm not party to as well, but still there is a lot in it for me.
Mhm. I'm wondering if I should show a tiny 5-second clip of Missing Can. I don't know if you think of that.
Let's do that.
Okay. I have
Yes.
to just figure
Have,
out how to
I've
do
just
it.
let you share.
so
Okay.
so
Hopefully that will.
so Naeem, it's just when you share, like you have to
Hmm.
just click the button to optimize for video and
Oh, that is for some reason not gray. It's gray for me for some reason.
uh,
Yeah, hopefully it'll
fix
still work.
that.
I'm just going to show a nanosecond clip. Sorry, I have to adjust it so we're not seeing ourselves. Sorry, I didn't cue this up, so now you're going to see me move around the screen. Maybe I'll just let me know if the sound plays.
I can hear it.
So maybe I'll pause there and just say something also about the conditions of filming. These are not things you can plan ever. I went to Bangladesh last summer, right after the government fell. The 15-year autocratic regime collapsed overnight, as regimes often do after appearing to be, we will be here forever. Suddenly, one day, they're gone. Um, uh, and I arrived about 7-8 days later. Because I just wanted to just be there and find. And there was, a tremendous flurry of activity, lots of things happening. Suddenly there were seminars every day. Everybody's talking about what kind of Bangladesh do we want? What kind of constitution do we want? What kind of position for women? Moment of tremendous hope, which unfortunately that's not what we are in right now. But in the midst of that, there was this just feeling of, after attending maybe my 30th seminar or 30th meeting discussion with artists or academics, that I should get back to my work. That's literally how I felt, because that's how I can, the language of contribute, that's how I can contribute was there. It was a very, I think, optimistic time. And that's why I went back to this project, because this project had been stalled for years, had been between essay and cinema. What was it going to be? Zohir Rahed is almost too big a figure. You enter the Film Development Corporation and his image is right there. It's the first image. And then there's Satyajit Ray, and that's it. That's a cinema pantheon. Obviously no female directors have made the cut on that building's wall. So it has its own masculinist logic as well. And one of the things about the Film Development Corporation is that, of course, it was empty because there was nobody in charge. Suddenly, there was no boss, but they were still workers. So part of the film is also just like roaming the grounds and just seeing people walking around quite aimless. Now, the Film Development Corporation is also sometimes aimless for a different reason, which is that people aren't shooting on film as much, and they're also not using the FDC because of the commercial space. But I thought that ghostly space was something I wanted to inhabit. And then also the contradiction that comes up is when I face that much reverence, I'm always a bit wary because I feel that reverence is possible when the director, when the person is not around. Therefore, you can form mythologies around him because the living person is not there to contradict your wishes for them. And that's what's trying to inhabit. And then in this moment, you actually see one possible influence of this famous scene from Behula in a 1930s musical, which may not be there, with just my theorizing. So yeah, maybe that's what I'll say. I think Esther definitely felt that the way the sentences were structured, which is a incomplete haiku, people won't maybe get all that or figure it out. Also because there's no punctuation, you don't know when things end. Um, and that's definitely a moment where I feel like if you know a little bit of it, it's actually enough. Even then, it's almost like over explaining already. But to the Irish audience, it was probably abstraction, which is so the film is the film, but the abstraction comes when the audience shifts. Maybe I'll stop sharing so we can see each other.
Yes,
I'm
fantastic.
relieved
So
that worked technically also. I was just like, oh, it's going to be, I'm going to start and it's going to just stutter and stop. And it
no,
didn't.
no, that was really great. Thank you so much. I have so many more questions that I want to ask you, and I'm conscious that we're almost out of time. So I wonder, Marla, do you want to come back in? How do we use this last few minutes together? Are there any questions?
Or comments can be just people's own
Yeah,
thoughts.
Yes. Hi, thank you so much. That was really rich and such a treat um to see a bit of that film, which I'm hoping we can see. I know I have a question if people are waiting to put their questions in the chat, which I know that you both, it's a big burden to try and get you both to answer the question of
Yeah. I'm also happy to go beyond the hour. It's all up
perfect.
to you if you need to. Yeah, because we ate up some time with the film. So maybe if we need to go over, that's okay.
Yeah. I'm just gonna oh, I unspotlighted. Sorry. We were
That's okay. You can spotlight
spotlighted,
yourself.
and then now we're all
Naeem's
spotlighted
gone.
again. So I'll quickly ask my question. It's actually more personal interest probably, but it's something that Naeem, you've spoken about some of the mentors and key figures in Bangladesh, and you've mentioned Satyajit Ray and Raihan and Ben. I know that in preparation for the program and a lot of the times we've spoken, you've also spoken about this region, our region's long-standing tradition with the medium. Why do you, and I know I didn't want to put the big burden on you both, but why do you think that this medium has resonated so strongly with artists and filmmakers in the region? And perhaps are there a few further names or films that people in the room might end up going down a rabbit hole? As I said, personal selfish question. I'd also like to know where to kind of look to the names and figures who are foundational in the rationale for behind why this
I
is important.
Yeah, I think for me, Yasmin Kobir is a very significant filmmaker from Bangladesh. Yasmine, and then Kabir. She's made a small body of work. She's very selective, and there are long gaps. But she was very early with, at least in my experience, my viewing, very early with the strategies of or ideas of using the letter. Um, in this case, it was a letters being written between a migrant in Malaysia and his mother, except the letters were in the form of cassettes that he would record. I don't know if that was because literacy was an issue or that was just a format, and he would mail the cassette tapes. And the last cassette tape she received was before the disaster arrives. And he says this extraordinary thing in the recording where he says, you know, if I could speak to anyone, mother, you're speaking to your mother, but it's almost you're speaking to the entire potential migrant community. I would tell them, don't come to Malaysia. Whatever you do, don't come to Malaysia. And, you know, migration is such a key aspect of global life now. And to say that a migration might have been a mistake is perhaps sometimes the hardest thing to say. And Yasmin occupied that space in this film called My Migrant Soul. And then she made two other extraordinary films that are very influential. So that's somebody very early that also, when I first started seeing her film, I was like, who is this person? How did they make this film? Who is watching this film? Who are the 10 people that are watching this film? Or Manzar Hassan Murad made one film called Our Boys, which was very early to document rock music actually in Dhaka as a scene. It was not considered proper culture. And yeah, so those were, I mean, there are many others. I mean, there's this strange thing that we've experienced in Bangladesh specifically, which is that three important filmmakers have all died just about 10 plus years apart. Zohir Raihan in early 72, Alamgir Kobir in the 80s, and then Tarek Masood in 2007. And they're all linked to each other. Alamgir Kobir was the voice, the narration, the very actually posh BBC kind of English in Raihan Stop Genocide. Then Alamgir Kobir is the voice in Tarek Masood's films. You can see the mentoring relationship, and then Alamgir Kobir dies. And then Tarek Masood wasn't a voice in one of my films, but was a very important mentor. And I was actually working on United Red Army and waiting to show it to him because I was nervous to show him an unfinished version when he passed away. So there's that strange like the line of transmission stops when the person passes away. Then all is left for you is to do the annual commemorations and write about them, which I've written about Tariq Masood. But what you're deprived from is also the relationship of arguing. Bahas, debate, or even disagreement is pretty core. And I think it would be, if you didn't get into a debate and argument with your former mentor, something's off because you're supposed to eventually part ways. That's just part of the transmission. I mean, you can be respectful, but still disagree. And that's taken away when the figure passes away. And that's been something I think that has suffused the film scene of having figures to revere, but not to have those same figures available to argue with. I'm not saying the name of the filmmaker, it's somebody, South Asian, Indian filmmaker who's one of the later films I was watching. I was like, oh, that young enfant terrible is not there anymore. And I wanted to critique, but I'm also like loyal to my memories of the early film. But at least they're around. If I ever get in a room with them, I would just say, this is what I think about the latest film. You're deprived of that when the person passes away.
Thank you, Naeem.
Did you notice how it's giving you names to inspire also brought in death? I can't help it. Oh, there are lots of questions in the chat.
Yeah, there are.
Sorry, Ben, you were going to say something.
Ben, do you want to add any?
maybe we should move on to some of these other questions. I think
so. The first question and second question probably combined, but one is how can someone collaborate as a Pakistani independent documentary filmmaker with an experienced Bangla filmmaker? And I'll add the second question so you can kind of add anything. So the second one is from Sadia. Naeem mentioned that filmmakers in the region may assume that their work will circulate more in the region than outside of it. In a lot of cases, it hasn't worked out that way. Have any of your films circulated more in Bangladesh than internationally, and which ones?
That's the Sadia question. Thank you, Sadia. And Sadia is also the one who gave the proper translation of Dudh Bhat, milk toast. That one's maybe an easier question. The film that has circulated, I would say, at least as much in Bangladesh as internationally, at least measured by impactful screenings and people wanting to come back to it, is United Red Army, 2011-12. And that's for many reasons, but one is that, it is structured unintentionally, I would say, but once it was made and screened, then I realized it had inadvertently become that. It's structured as a thriller. You're waiting to find out what is going to happen. And it's such an obscure event, the 1977 hijack of Japan Airlines, that it wasn't well known what had happened. So it circulated a lot for that reason. The second reason, which I think is much more directly political, is that it's an event post the first government of Bangladesh, and in some ways kind of maps into this idea. I don't fully necessarily agree with it, but the idea is certainly there, that the military was somehow more efficient in running Bangladesh than the civilian government, right? So 75 to 80 is the first major military government, and this hijack happens then. So I think there was a way that it also tapped into this idea of things will be run efficiently. I mean, honesty in governance has been an obsession for 55 years, and people have gone through the idea of nationalism serving that, then the military is serving that, then the nationalists again, and maybe now they feel that only the Islamists can bring honesty. It's an obsession. So that film has circulated a lot That's the one that has circulated the most. The one that circulated the least actually is Two Meetings and a Funeral, because it's a 3-channel film. It has shown at Bengal Foundation in Dhaka, which Sadia has also worked with. And beyond that, it hasn't circulated. I think that was also because of a nervousness around the political period that it was looking at, which is 73, 74, which is almost at the end of the first civilian government. And it's not a film that is comfortable for the civilian government, but people just wanted to stay away from that topic. Tanzim, who you know very well, Sadia, and I talked about trying to organize more screenings. And then, of course, all sorts of things happened in the last 2-3 years that made any kind of regular. That's one I really would want to show more in Bangladesh. And 3-channel is not very complex to install anymore. There are methods and mechanisms, but I think there's a way that people immediately think, okay, that's Hangama. That's going to be a lot of work. What do you have that's one channel? One channel, just people can imagine immediately. So Grace is a single channel, which is why it was very relatively easy to organize. Although, of course, Kekasha did a lot to make sure it shows properly.
Thank you, Naeem. Sorry to put you in the position of like talking to at screen. Thank you for the detailed answer.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Sadia and Naeem. So it's a big question, but we've got 2 more and then we'll probably close. One is, how can we present the present? How can we place the present social media-based video production dissemination in the history of moving image practice? And what is the future of the gallery-based practices? So maybe...
Shall I try?
That sounds like a Ben question.
Shall I try and field that? No,
yeah,
Ben, you go for it. That's a Ben question.
Okay, I'll give you a break. So I think in terms of social media-based video production and dissemination, I mean, one of the things about this area of practice is, I think I said this in the last talk as well, the practice is always very hard, further ahead than discourse. And I think these things are happening much faster than our ability to account for them in some ways. So I would just say it's too new for us to understand what this will be like in kind of history. I always think about, I can't remember what the stats are, but there's some, like even something like YouTube. There is a huge amount of video uploaded to YouTube every single day. So there's this massive amount of stuff. Massive amount of moving image that just is generated and uploaded every day. So it's very hard to imagine how that will be sifted through and what the history of this work will be in the future and how this will be accounted for. I mean, I think we're struggling to account for these, as Naeem was talking earlier, these kind of lost histories of things from like the 70s and things like that, where we're trying to catch up with all of these other histories. So, and there's an urgency about this as well, because I think, when we think about kind of moving image discourse, it's absolutely online. Things like, I always say this, things like TikTok, hugely influential in terms of our visual culture in some ways, and how do we account for these things that are coming at us? It's so fast and in such huge amounts. So yeah, it's hard to answer that, and I'll just so that will have to be subject to another talk maybe. And the second thing about future gallery-based practice, and I assume you mean moving image there. I would just say like moving image isn't going to go away anytime soon. If we think about a lot of the kind of great art of the last 50 years, it is in moving image. The issue is in terms of institutions catching up. And I think I said this last time as well, we have like hundreds of years of history in terms of dealing with things like painting and sculpture. We have very recent history, only 100 years or so of moving image. But, I think if we're talking art historically, it's not going to go away, and it's absolutely with us. And I think also this area of practice is absolutely contemporary as well. It speaks to the contemporary moment, it has a velocity that reflects our life. It seems very, very relevant. So I feel very positive about it. But I think, again, related to my last point, I think media moves faster than the institutions that could serve it are able to move. So we're in a very interesting moment, I think, of like making sense of this. And I think, that really shown by Naeem's work as well, there's reflexivity in this practice as well, that we're even thinking, as we make these works, we're thinking through its life as well. and I think there is this, like, we're making and we're thinking through making all of the time.
Yeah.
But
I
yeah,
wanted to
so
add, sorry,
yeah,
go ahead, Ben.
please. No, please
No,
go on, you
I
add.
was gonna add one more thing, just as you're speaking about all the medium, and obviously we're awash in content now. Like, imagine if you considered every YouTube video to be a little film premiere, how many there are every day. Um, but just to say, I teach at Columbia in an MFA program, and part of the reason I went to do the teaching is because I also wanted to be in this continuous dialogue with a student body that's largely in their 20s and 30s, and of course coming from very different visual practices than me. And one of the first head shocks I had about 2-3 years ago was, when I first started seeing all these students making video, which defiantly always has the black bar on the left and the right and is in portrait format. So from a very, I would say, now my visual habits are archaic. From an archaic habit of, if it's 16:9, the entire screen should be filled and would have this very slow shots like you see in the Zohir Raihan film. The camera is achingly slow in its tracking, right? Which is also a practical thing to make sure that the cameraman doesn't trip. Then you have your students who are making these films, which are like boom, 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 like crashing into you, all YouTube videos that none of which they shot, all like none of this conversation about rights and go and license nothing. And I was somebody said, "Oh, where'd you get this?" "Oh, I just got it from the internet." And I'm like, "Okay, but do you know this person?" "No, I don't even remember who it is." They don't even care, right? So then you have this head shock. You're not in a journalism program, so therefore you're not bound by having to say, "Oh, you should get the rights." It's an art program, so that's exactly what they're supposed to do. But you can still sense your shock, or kind of like, oh. And then sometimes, of course, you're in dialogue with your students, you might aspire to make something like that. And that's the moment when I realized, but actually that's not the language that comes organically to me. I mean, I admire it, enjoy it, understand it as radically different. But just as if I start throwing the phrase slay into every sentence, as my niece Zainab does, my it would be, oh, uncle is trying to be kind of with the moment. I think some of these video forms I accept are not organic to me because I haven't come up in TikTok style, but I enjoy watching it and I like to mark the difference. And so Ibraz, which is launching their online journal very soon, asked me to write about Missing Can, and I tried to make a dialogue with Owen Ryan's film at the same biennial called Carceral Jigs, precisely because Owen's film is so different. Owen's film has these cuts where the clips go by 1000 BPM. I enjoy it, but I know that it's not the one that organically flows from me. And so I think it's also okay to uh, recognize the difference, which is both generational and also habits that are built in. I mean, when you first started asking me questions, Ben, my examples took us back to the 1990s because that really was formative. And also, I just remembered one other thing. Somebody had a question about where to find things on Ejaz. There isn't much. He was always away from the Spotlight and Video Guide. I have scanned them for my own purposes, but it isn't online. But I feel like when I read that question, I feel these things should be online. Sadia has talked about collaborating on new conversations. Sadia and I collaborated on a conversation that came out in the book Midnight's Third Child. I would say that I have maybe been also focused on documenting the narratives of literary figures and filmmakers in some traditional mold. And somebody like Ajaz Ahmed Khan Mozlish and that form of video making that he went through, that I think doesn't get categorized as art, deserves to be archived. And the person who asked that question is now inspiring me of a way to figure out how to do all that. Future project.
Thank you. I don't know if there's any more questions or if Ben and Naeem have anything else they'd like to add, but thank you both so much for such a rich conversation. I didn't want to butt in because I thought it was such
No,
a
no, it's okay. I will say there's one other question about
I,
Pakistani
oh
maker who
yeah, of
wanted to
course,
collaborate. Yeah,
collaboration.
I would just say that probably what that person is referencing is actually the fact that the actual human back and forth between Pakistan and Bangladesh has historically been limited for rather obvious reasons. The post residue of the 71 war and everything since. So there's more conversations between Bangladeshi and Indian makers, Bangladeshi and Sri Lankan makers, etc. There's less of that. But I think the plus, of course, of this period that we live in is you can reach out to someone and work with them without having to geographically deal with visas and permissions. I mean, of course, ideally, you want to arrive in Dhaka or you want someone to arrive in Karachi, but if that's not feasible, working with someone is possible because of Zoom. And on Missing Can, I work with Mehro Shalom, a researcher in Pakistan who went through the Pakistani archives looking for residues of Zohir Raihan. And in some ways, she didn't find anything. And that was part of the point, that there wasn't anything because he was once a East Pakistani filmmaker. Now he's a Bangladeshi filmmaker, and that's where the narrative ends. But that's somebody I work with without having physically, we haven't physically seen each other. We were still able to do all the work through WhatsApp and Zoom and everything else. So they're not, of course, ever as good as the real thing. Like Ben and I walking in the park outside of Lux is always more satisfying than, of course, this Zoom. But this Zoom is not bad until we get the in real person situation.
Thank you, Naeem, and thank you, as I said, for being so generous with your time to share with the audience and to speak with each other as well. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today. As I said at the beginning, it will be recorded. It is recorded, and it will be on our website in the coming weeks. And I wish everyone a really lovely weekend and nice pondering on everything we've heard today.